Dámy a pánové, já vás tady moc vítám, děkuji, že jste přišli. A je mi velkou ctí, že můžu přivítat Ženiu Gubkinu. A já teda, abych dostala slušnému chování, tak se přepnu do angličtiny. Takže let me introduce Žena Gubkina, who is our dear colleague from Kharkiv. And I'm really happy that she was able to come. And that she will have the lecture about the actual situation in Kharkiv and in the whole Ukraine. And I hope that she will also talk about our special small project about Kharkiv Trail that should be published on Brno Architecture Manual. And as you probably know, Genia is the historian of architecture. She is a co-founder of NGO Urban Center Forums. And she is also co-author of some interesting project as Ukrainian constructivism and Ukrainian encyclopedia, which is on the website online. So, Ženia, it's yours. Thank you.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Veronica, and thank to Brno House of Arts, Brno Architecture Manual, BAM, and the Brno Magistrat for having me here in this very difficult moment, actually, of history for Ukraine. And I would share maybe small information how everything started and why I'm here. 5 years ago, I was in Brno as a member of Ukrainian delegation of architects, exactly invited by Magistrat of Brno and Czech Center in Ukraine. And it was very important tour or journey for us, I think, because it was a gathered group of architects from Lviv and Kharkiv. And it was so interesting because our main focus of our trip was actually exactly interwar modernism and the heritage protection issues. And I think that is something that can bring us some bridge between yesterday and today. Because exactly both in Lviv and in Kharkiv, that is a great heritage of interwar modernism. If we talk about Lviv, it's much more about functionalism or Polish functionalism. And if we talk about Kharkiv, that is, of course, Ukrainian constructivism or Ukrainian Soviet constructivism. And 1 year ago, we became partners with Brno Architectural Manual, BAM, and we actually applied for a quite interesting foundation, for a quite interesting grant called House of Europe. And we won that grant to make and to develop architectural application actually for mobile phones that can be like a guide. A bit gamified guide to architectural heritage of Kharkiv, exactly of interwar period. So that is a long story of relationship with Brnyansky Architectural Manual. And moreover, I think that in future we'll continue our work, that mobile application will be ready actually in the end of this year. And another part is that one route on architectural heritage of Kharkiv will be added to the website of BAM. But what we talked today with the team of BAM, that maybe it would be very important to share exactly the route on destroyed or partially damaged objects of Kharkiv. Because we can't not to react on the situation what happened, and maybe to rethink understanding of what is actually tourism and architectural tourism and what is actually architectural history, because that history is deeply connected exactly with what happened now. And if we talk about heritage, I think we shouldn't be silent or shouldn't be, I don't know, blind exactly to the current situation. So I think if we talk about heritage, we should understand that not just architecture is deeply political things, but exactly heritage and heritage protection is quite political too. So I hope our project will continue. But today I want to tell you exactly about demolitions. So it will be maybe a very sad lecture in response on the current situation in Ukraine and war started by Russia. There is the questions actually, who can help and what should be done. That is the questions that are mostly all the time asked by Ukrainians, who can actually help. And I think that today it's quite difficult to talk about heritage. Sometimes you think that when people die, there is no place to talk about heritage or to talk about architecture, because it's not on the first line when we talk about that. The same with even UNESCO issues or the UN issues. Usually we talk about Red Cross or people dying or migration crisis and so on. But at the same time, heritage, it's not just walls and bricks. I think, first of all, it is what is beyond. And what is actually there. There are people of yesterday, people of tomorrow, and people of today. Their stories, their lives, and their history. And today, people in Ukraine very oftenly said, history repeats. What does it mean, history repeats, actually? Yeah, it is actually. So lots talks about, let's talk about architecture and a war, or architecture in the war. We used to recognize such pictures of demolitions and ruined cities just with World War II. We had a lot of examples of ruined cities, ruined historical cities in Rotterdam in Netherlands. There is Warsaw. Here is Dresden. But now in the 21st century, the history repeats, actually. There is Irpin in Ukraine. Here is Mariupol. Destructions of historical cities, it's not just the destructions of social infrastructure, that is, of course, humanitarian issues. But from other side, when Russian army hits exactly central parts of the cities, of historical cities, we should understand that that is a part of so-called genocide convention. So that is a part of such a term, such a phenomenon of what is genocide. Exactly because of that, demolition of cultural heritage is a part of international law procedure according to genocide phenomena. I think that is very important to understand that when Russian army destroys historical cities of Ukraine, they try to destroy memory, they try to destroy our culture. And it's not just modernism. Actually, there is a lot of other styles that are hit by Russian army. And our usual question was, who actually can help in that situation? From very first days of war, our architectural community and the community of architectural historians asked international community who can help. So any international organization like World Heritage, UNESCO, and ICOMOS, the COMOMO actually can't help. Usually they said that please document everything what happened. Actually, that is everything what we can do, document. Usually that is a typical answer. What we can do, document. Another point is that we should really find all that and gather all that evidences of war crimes, because exactly the demolition of architectural heritage is a part of that typology, that type of actions that is a war crime. So I will tell you today much more about my native city, Kharkiv. And Kharkiv is a sister city of Brno. And here on the picture, you can see the house palace of a labor, Dvorets Truda, in the central part of Kharkiv. It was built in 1914, before the First World War started. It was a huge building that situated exactly in the huge area, huge quarter, like the one-quarter building. A bit looks like Prefect Osman reconstruction of Paris. And that building is listed in our local list of monuments of architecture. Here you can see how it looked like outside. And that is really in first days when war started, maybe really on the first week of war, exactly the central part of the city was under shelling. And really that situation showed that nothing really is important for nothing, no some ethical or moral issues is in interest of Russian army. And moreover, first it looked like there is accidental explosions or accidental bombings and something like that. Maybe somebody just hit central part and that's all. But when one city by another city, historical city, was under shelling, I think we should understand that that is a tactic. That is actually the tactic of war to demolish exactly central parts and historical cities. Moreover, not just historical objects and central parts, because we should understand that historical city consists from, first of all, it starts from the central part, with fortress and other things established. And Kharkiv grown up from the fortress, military settlements of Cossacks in 1654. It was like Baroque fortress. And then city developed exactly near the central part, near that walls of former fortress. That part of the city called Old City. As in any European city, we always have Staré Město or something like that. And the most quantity of objects of heritage situated exactly in that part. That's why when they demolished exactly the central part of the city, they demolished the heart of the city, the history of the city, and the most important object, with a lot of administrative buildings, with museums, with fonts of different archives, and so on. So it's really the part of the tactic of war, of demolition of our cultural heritage. And not some. I was quite often asked by journalists, maybe Russians hit exactly the specific layer, historical layer of our cities. It's quite funny, I think, question, because of course they are not architects or I don't know, art historians. That's why they don't understand the styles. And actually they hit all the objects in the central part of the city, and the aim is exactly to demolish the city. Moreover, it's very important to mention that it's not just administrative objects, because first part of war, it seems like maybe they will hit just military objects or infrastructural objects, but what we all seen through these days, through these months from media, that even social infrastructure, that is absolutely understandable that a lot of people, children, old people can be exactly situated and being in that objects, they are under the heat. So hospitals, kindergartens, schools, and mass housing. So first aim was mass housing. And first people, I think, thought that maybe that is again some accidental thing. Maybe they want to hit some other target. But that is absolutely obvious for now. That is again another dimension of that war crimes. That is the war crime again against civilians, because exactly their main aim was the civil infrastructure and exactly dwelling districts. So, for example, in Kharkiv we have the biggest in Soviet Union residential area called Saltovka. The population of that district is 500,000 people. It's like city actually. So exactly this part of the city is under total shelling 24 from 24. And of course, everybody of us saw pictures from Mariupol, and now it's absolutely understandable that exactly civilian infrastructure and not surprising, but exactly modernism, mass housing modernism now are under threat because of the function actually. And what is the function of mass housing? to help people live and have a lot of apartments in that buildings. That's why a lot of people actually lived in that micro-rayons. Huge quantity of people live there, and that's why that is under the heating. So different stylistic periods. Here you can see some historicism and some, we call that style modern, but it's much more like Jugendstil or Secession or Art Nouveau. Here we can see some industrial objects that is red brick architecture example, monument of our local list of heritage. It was twice under shelling, and now you can see that it's nearly impossible to reconstruct that with I can say that criteria that UNESCO usually use, criteria of authenticity. So we should understand that authenticity criteria is not appropriate now, unfortunately, for our heritage, because all that wooden details, all that materials and fabrics and some small details and, for example, floor, usually we miss that. That's why it's really like a part of that tactics to hit our cultural heritage, because now, even if we reconstruct that, it will never be the same object. Again, some red brick architecture of the end of the 19th century. That is Art Nouveau building in very central part of the city, and exactly that building actually preserved a lot of authentic details in interior. And it's very sad that exactly that object was heated. Unfortunately, some people died exactly in that object. Actually, when we see all the demolitions, we should all the time understand another side of that. And as I started that lecture from the words that what is beyond heritage, we should understand that beyond heritage, they are people, actually. And when we see that pictures, we should understand that they actually had people there inside of that spaces. So at the same time that pictures made Kharkiv somehow visible, and some art historians and architectural historians and architectural critics said me that now we actually learned the history of Kharkiv and learned how Kharkiv looked like because of that destruction pictures. Exactly this building was in the reportage of Vice News and became quite famous. And it's such a strange irony that sometimes heritage became more visible and became more powerful when it's actually demolished, when we actually lost that. That is the building of university, of economical faculty of university. It's again very central part of the city. Here is Sumskaya Street that connects old city and new city, because Kharkiv central system, urban system, developed exactly in, I can call that like double-centered system. So we had old city and new city, and exactly old city, it was that historical part of the city, and new city, it was developed in the period of the 20s and 30s as a governmental center. And Sumskaya Street, the central street of Kharkiv, connected that two centers. Here is the building actually developed in the 20s, as I remember, 1926, 1927, but under the project that was designed in the period of, before revolution period, under the project of architect Timoshenko. Timoshenko was the Minister of Infrastructure in UNR, Ukrainian People's Republic, and he was quite interesting figure, personality in our architectural history, because he was architect who is politician, and he was the representative of so-called Ukrainian modern. Ukrainian national modern. In abbreviation, we usually call that UAM. UAM. That means that from 1906-1907, Ukrainian local architectural school that was actually established in Kharkiv in the end of the 19th century in our technical university, because Kharkiv in the end of the 19th century exactly built the technical university in response of industrial revolution and a lot of factories, because Kharkiv is a historically industrial city. And exactly on the basis of that local architectural school, that movement, Ukrainian national moderns, started grown up. What is interesting that that architectural style developed exactly from literature circles. First, it was a small club, literature club, that developed Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian culture, songs, folk things, and all other. So gathered that a bit ethnical, traditional things, because before 1906 it was banned to develop Ukrainian language and banned to develop Ukrainian culture. And architecture developed exactly through that, actually, literature circles. I think that is something maybe a bit like from semiotic, because usually postmodernist critics, they use that metaphoric idea that architecture actually has a language. So all this went through the language, and the Ukrainian architectural modern was a part of such a statement that Ukraine actually has its own movement, separate and autonomous. So unfortunately, that picture again made Kharkiv quite famous in last days, because it was on the first week of war. It was under heat, and nobody understood what is the reason actually to heat that object. It was in very good condition before it was heated. Unfortunately, now it's burnt, and that is the question how it will be reconstructed and how to conserve that object in such situation. Another period is exactly 20th and 30th. So Kharkiv is famous, first of all, of that so-called golden age of Kharkiv. It was exactly interwar period when Kharkiv was the capital of Soviet Ukraine. Exactly in that period, it was construction boom in Kharkiv. So the biggest quantity of object in Kharkiv that listed now, actually there is constructivism or interwar modernism objects. And some really iconic buildings like Держпром or actually that building, because that building that is a club of railway workers made under the project of academic of architecture Dmitriev. That is really like in each book about history of Soviet architecture, you can find that object. And that was in very good condition, actually, because before football championship Euro 2012, as I remember, that Kharkiv was a part of that championship. I don't know how it happened, but we were very lucky that we got some money on restoration, exactly, and conservation of that object. And a few beautiful murals inside of that building, they were conservated. Moreover, a lot of frameworks and windows and doors and some details, they were preserved and conservated. So that was actually like the best example of a conservative project in Kharkiv. And it was the place where usually all architectural conferences held to show that actually in Ukraine we have some conservation tradition and restoration tradition. Unfortunately, that object was under the heat, as I remember, 2 weeks ago, so not so far. From that perspective, it's more or less okay, but from courtyard, it's like totally damaged. And you can see that right wing of the building that is again demolished. And you can see on the first floor entrance, that is a bit Art Deco style already, with a lot of details, with marble details, very interesting object. And it was beautiful wooden doors with authentic glass, actually. And unfortunately, now you can see that there is a wooden shield to protect building from the environment. And it means that we lost that doors. Another building that is an example of so-called cooperative housing. That is actually the movement, cooperative movement. It's not something just about Ukraine or Soviet Union. You know, maybe that in Berlin, in a lot of other countries where socialist government appeared in the power, it was a lot of projects connected exactly with cooperative movements. So people actually cooperate together and ordered the project and built it together. Quite interesting socialistic idea. That building situated on the main Sumskaya street. Unfortunately, it was a bit under reconstruction of our city council. They painted that just half a year ago in very stupid colors, I think. So that paint job, it's something very typical for any city administrations. I don't know why. But actually, object was in very good condition. Inside space, I made I documented and made the photos of inside space. It was in very good conditions. And usually people even asked why exactly this building had no that, you know, balconies that usually is in post-Soviet countries. And on the first floor, it was very, how to say, expensive shops like Max Mara, Escada, and all this stuff. So it's really very central part of the city. Unfortunately, that building was again under the shelling, and unfortunately, you can't see a neighbor building, but that is a very good example of that secession or Art Nouveau style. So really, like the whole that first line, because we have that Sumskaya Street, it's like in Chicago, Magnificent Mile. It's our central street that is most protected by law, and had a lot of beautiful objects. And exactly that first line of our city is like on the half demolished or damaged. Some demolished, sometimes I think that we can call that damaged. There is another building of Meteorological Institute. So again, no reason why exactly that function, no reason why exactly this building. And it was quite interesting, I think, too. And that is, again, something about constructivism and about interwar modernism exactly in Soviet Ukraine. And here is maybe one of the most famous cooperative houses in Kharkiv, the house Slova, or word in English. That was the cooperative house where exactly all the most famous authors, poets of Ukraine lived in the 20s and 30s. And most of them, they were executed during Stalinist repressions. And that's why that object is the most maybe famous in Kharkiv and in Ukraine, that is deeply connected with our avant-garde futuristic movements in literature and in art, and moreover very tragic, because that object, being even still being a residential house, represents exactly some commemorative practices and some questionable and sometimes controversial questions, how to preserve such a tragic story, how to preserve such a traumatic experience when people still live in that building. And it was a discussions for many times with locals, because they usually said that we don't want to live on cemetery, because that object is really very iconic. It's like all people who somehow research that period of the 20s and 30s or literature, they need to be there. So it's exactly our very important place. Even I can say maybe sacral. And from other side, people still live there, and they need just ordinary apartments. They need to grow children and to feel themselves happy, not to feel that they actually are living in apartments where somebody died or somebody was killed. So actually, that is the question of Kharkiv in general, because of course, being a capital of Soviet Ukraine, the most population of intelligentsia and actually all representatives of so-called phenomena of executed renaissance or shooting renaissance. It means artists and poets and all other leaders of culture that were killed during Stalinist repression. we can say that Kharkiv is somehow a grave of that people, because exactly in this place they were taken into the prison or even executed nearby of Kharkiv in the wooden area. So being a part of the history of the 20th century, Kharkiv is a place with a lot of marks of different historical events, very tragic events, including Holodomor, including that executed Renaissance and Stalinist repression, and all, including the execution of Polish officers, and a lot of other things, including Holocaust. And what is surprising is that in last weeks, I have no idea why it happened, but Russian army shelled exactly memoriams. And I have no idea why they decided to fight with graves, actually. But in Kharkiv, they hit it to Drobitsky Yar. It's like the same example like Babi Yar, the place of execution during Holocaust of Jewish people. And they even demolished the symbol of that memorial menorah. They hit it, the memorial built by Polish government to an honor of execution of Polish officers in 1938. It's in our green zone of Kharkiv. And I don't know why they hit it, the memorial of Red Army, people who died during the Second World War. So that is actually not just, I don't know, the war. It's definitely not the war for territories, and that is definitely not the war for people. It's much more like the war for history and for narrative, who will occupy actually the narrative and discourse, I think, historical actually discourse. And another historical layer, here we can see the building built in 1934 for city administration. That can bring a connection with the Magistrate of Brno, I think, because that is actually our city hall. And it was built in 1934 under the project of architect Tratsenko, again the member of that Ukrainian national modern movement, but who decided to stay in Soviet Ukraine. And he worked in different styles, but still he tried to somehow interpret national motives in architecture. But Sergei Timoshenko, another representative of architectural modern that I shown you, that university building, he actually immigrated. And first he immigrated in Poland, then in Czech Republic and worked in Prague. And then he immigrated in the USA, as I remember, but unfortunately then he died there. So Tratsenko decided to stay. And previously that building looked a bit more brutalistic, I can say. It was already not the 20s, not the roaring 20s or avant-garde 20s. It was much more like some, we can compare that style maybe with some fascist architecture or even some architecture of Speyer in Berlin. But after the Second World War, that building was under reconstruction because all the city was a part of such a systematic actions of Stalinist architects that called Stalinist Reconstruction, Stalinist post-war reconstruction of the cities. That is a quite interesting phenomenon. And that's why that building gained that layer of socialist realism with a lot of that details, with a lot of that classical details, and it a bit grown, and you can see some symbols of Soviet power. All that layer of decoration appeared exactly after the Second World War. And one of the reasons how that reconstructions appeared, usually it pretended to be a part of rebuilding of the cities, demolished cities after bombing and after artillery destructions and so on. But from other side, I can say that Kharkiv is an example of quite a modernist capital, new capital, with a lot of objects exactly connected with new economical politics and with such a phenomenon of national communism, I think can be quite dangerous for the construct of quite imperialistic construct of Stalinism. That's why I think that it was the aim to manipulate somehow with the space in such a cities, because when you cover with that decoration all the buildings of modernism, then everybody will think that that building was built exactly in the period of Stalin, post-war period. But at the same time, actually that objects had a structure, modernist structure, and was built by different budget, not by and not in the period of Stalinist Reconstruction. I think that that is a very important point, how history in space changed the focus from new economical politics and interwar period in Ukraine to some Stalinist rebuilding, and moreover to forget something about the 20s and 30s. That period, and it's interesting that even in critical text of so-called socialist realism architects, never mentions that Kharkiv was the capital of Soviet Ukraine for many years. Even during Brezhnev period, I don't know why, but even in guidebooks that was written by different architectural critics, it was never mentioned that Kharkiv was the capital of Soviet Ukraine. So we were like a forgotten capital of Soviet Ukraine. And here you can see maybe our most significant object of modernism, or even leftist urbanism, as I call that. That is the governmental center of Soviet Ukraine. Exactly that place of power should be exactly at the heart from which that new economical politics and national communism state should somehow manage with all Ukraine, actually. And we should understand that not everything was actually Soviet Union, and Soviet Union consists from 15 republics, and Soviet Ukraine Republic, it was autonomous republic with the separate budget, with the separate projects, and that governmental center, I think, is an attempt and is an example how architects try to show what is a new type of power. And I remember that I saw a photo. You can see that round square in the middle of that urban complex, and it was written such a motto there on the central part of the square: to manage in new way. In Ukrainian, it was written "керувати по-новому," and I think to manage in new way, to be new type of power, it's something quite interesting, according exactly what was the political construct of Soviet Ukraine in those times. Moreover, they try to implement the idea how to manage in new way through such an abstract idea of square, exactly central square. And how actually they try to interpret what is that new world that they try to build, what is that new universe actually. You can see that even round forms that can somehow work with that universal ideas. So first of all, in the central part of that new world should be exactly Держпром building. And usually people don't think what is actually Держпром. So Держпром or Gazprom in Russian language, people usually think that it's somehow connected with Gazprom, a Russian gas organization, but nothing is near that. Gazprom, it's an abbreviation from Russian language государственная промышленность, Госпром, or in Ukrainian державна промисловість, Держпром. What does it mean? It means state industriality. So in the period of new economical politics, that actually is not something common with the common administrative system that we all here know about late socialism. It's a bit different hybrid system, economical hybrid between capitalism and socialism. So it means that it still preserves some capitalistic functions. For example, here should be exactly in the building of Держпром. It should be the place like office building, office skyscraper, actually the first skyscraper in Soviet Union made from concrete. It should be a place, an office for all state industrial trusts and syndicates. And even in that words, you can see that that commonness, that comparable to American system. And for example, some historians and architectural historians, they even called that period as Ukrainian or Soviet Americanism. From other side, here on the first plan of the picture, you can see the house of projects. Exactly the place where all urban planners, all architects should be situated. But actually, the first function of the building should be the House of Parliament. And on the other side, you can see the beginning of construction of the House of Cooperation. So cooperation is again some function, some typology appeared exactly in the period of new economical politics. It's about agricultural cooperation. So it's nothing about совхоз or something like that, where people were like imprisoned in villages and should work for some state farms. But it's something about some small farms, quite independent, where people can gather together and actually be farmers. That's why, for example, it was a connection with the Kharkiv tractor factory, because people need tractors, actually. So that cooperation was banned, and trust and syndicates system. In 1927, the delaying of that system started, and in 1930, it's already stopped. So Stalin started that change to and the switch to common administrative system. And I can say that in a lot of Soviet propaganda books on history of Kharkiv and even on history, not architecture, just ordinary history, it was written that exactly new economical politics was a period of some crazy ideas, and it wasn't successful economically. But I'm definitely sure, and a lot of historians, they already researched that period, that it was quite successful. And the evidence of that success actually was, for example, huge construction boom and the growth of health, welfare of people. Moreover, I think the cultural development of such phenomena as executed Renaissance is an example of successful economical situation in those times. So, and I try to explain you without pictures the double center system of Kharkiv. And here you can see the old part of the city, and you can see such a dense old structure of the city. And here you can see that modern new part of the city that called new center or new city. And even here we can see such an evidence, such a beautiful essence of how modernists, urbanists, they understood the new construction in old urban structures. It's like a absolutely futuristic new detail or machine detail in the field of that old chaotic structure of the city and networks. Here you can see how it looked before the Second World War, quite puristic, and it's very huge. Who has been in Kharkiv, I'm definitely sure you all were very surprised of the huge scale of that monument, urbanist monument. Moreover, that is something like an attempt of modernist architect to involve people and pedestrians exactly to interacting with architecture and to use architecture as scenography. So that's all about emotions and about poetry in space, how to impress people, how to narrate people some stories through the space. And for example, the architect who designed Держпром building, that is actually now in temporary list of UNESCO World Heritage, He said that the main aim of good architect actually to have a thought, at least some thought, not even idea, but thought. But good architect can explain that idea in very simple words, that anybody can understand that thought. And I think that is again something about literature, actually, maybe because Lucia is here. That's why I want to make that connection between Ukrainian literature and how we try to narrate through architecture and how we try to narrate through space. Here you can see again some picture. Yes, it's before the Second World War. And one of the ideas of that building was to implement idea of horizontal communication through that bridges. So bridges is the central idea of that building. And actually the idea was that you can cross the building from one point to another inside the building. And there is a myth or some story that in the 60s, in the 50s, London brutalists, young architects, they saw some prints in very bad quality of Держпром building, and they were so inspired of the structure of the building that actually like a formation of infrastructural connections of the building. That building actually inspired London brutalists, and we all can see maybe somehow inspired by that buildings, such buildings like Barbican and other London brutalists, very famous iconic buildings. So to allow structure or infrastructure to be visible, that is the main idea. To make the skeleton of building like the main idea of the building, not to hide that via some details or some clause. And it was even the words of Serafimov that to put some clause on the building, it's a bad idea. It's better to open that and to allow the building to be naked, actually. So you can see such a building that looks a bit like skeleton, and some poets they even use such a metaphorical words that is the skeleton of some dino or some other huge animal. That is on the first. You can see exactly that house of projects. And you can imagine how many projects were designed in that period in Kharkiv, because that building is huge. Now that building is the building of State University. That was made under the project of the same author Serafimov, that Держпром building, but with his wife Serafimova in 1930 it was completed actually, but the project started in 1928. And here you can see the picture after the Second World War already, how that building was damaged. But still, even in such conditions, you can see the powerful idea of that building. And the idea of Serafimov was that he even calls that this volume that should be like a knife, and that will be very impression picture when exactly sun rises through that windows. You can see a light. So very spectacular using of the form and of the place exactly on the square. All that pictures after the Second World War, so that is the type of demolitions that actually was during the Second World War on this square. And here you can see the project of Stalinist Reconstruction. So it was really like, I don't know, each object that somehow damaged under the Second World War had such a project of reconstruction or decoration. And even when we talk about Stalinist architects' approach to architecture, usually we said, maybe sometimes ironically, that was decorative or decoration architecture. So actually they just put all that layer of details just on the building to cover that. Moreover, of course, we can see here some ideas to try to make that objects similar to Seven Sisters in Moscow, one of which is Lomonosov University. So that is university, and they try to make that building similar to university. But from other side, I can see here exactly an attempt to hide the layer of modernist architecture and to not to remember the memory of that period. Moreover, I think that Stalin actually didn't like modernism at all, and he did a lot of things to help socialist realism to develop and to be just a one style that is allowed to be implemented in architecture. That story started from 1932, actually, and I think all these dates somehow connected both with economical change, political change, and cultural change. But actually, they built that project. They tried to realize that project so long that actually Khrushchev came to power and Khrushchev though started. That's why when that project was under a committee, it was not allowed to build that in such appearance, because maybe you know that it was a fight with excess, as I remember, борьба с надлишками или борьба с излишествами, when exactly during Khrushchev's rule, it was the returning of second wave of modernism, like Khrushchevka and other types of economical, very cheap and minimalistic type of architecture, so quite socialist architecture. That's why they didn't realize all that ideas with columns and with some spire, but they did something in between. And such architecture that is in between in post-Soviet countries and in critical articles usually called обдирная. It means like scratched architecture, that some details, that Stalinist details, so they were deleted from or scratched from architecture. So that is scratched, how scratched architecture looks like. And from other side of the square, there is the Hotel International that was actually built for Comintern, Communist International Organization, but when it was finished, actually Comintern was banned and in Soviet Union, actually like in the same time, but anyway, for many years it was a hotel for international specialists, for international committees, for international delegations. But after the Second World War, it was decorated with, again, that Stalinist socialist realism layer under the project of the same architect Yanovitsky who designed previous one. And that is quite interesting that architects, they were obligated to change the appearance of their projects if they were alive, actually for free. And I think that it was a very traumatic thing for Yanovitsky, and it was some memories of Yanovitsky that it was very inappropriate for him to do that, but he decided that maybe it's better to do by him, not to allow to change his project by somebody else. And why it was so important for him, because exactly that project, previous one, this one, won some ownership during that Paris exhibition, where you remember that eagle of Germany stood in front with that рабочий и колхозница. So, and on another side of the square, just in front of Держпром building, Central Committee of Communist Party situated. And that is the first design of that object. And you can see that it was developed in 1927-1928 under the project of Jewish architect Steinberg. Yakov Steinberg was a theorist of quite radical, quite Marxist architecture of constructivism. He really tried to develop some new type of understanding what can be historical materialism in space. So when he was asked to design that building, he decided to use such, you can see that is actually collage, because that is the photo and that is the drawing. He always had very beautiful graphics. It was a part of his method. And how he describes the idea that if that is a central committee of Communist Party, he was asked to reconstruct old buildings, that two old buildings. It was the buildings of regional administration, actually, земства, in before revolution times. And the architecture of that buildings, it was like historicism, or Marxist architects, they usually called that eclectica, with some negative connotations. So he decided not to demolish that building and not just to forget about that building. He said that the idea of historical materialism should be to show both stages of development of history. And moreover, if that is exactly the main building of Central Committee of Ukrainian Party, he tried to show that there is actually that old bourgeois layer, historical layer, that is the basis, and that is the superstructure. So, basis in stroika, according to historical materialism or Marxism, is like the main core of Marxist theory, and he tried exactly to implement that in the most visible and minimalistic measures. And first, it was really realized in such way that is quite surprising, because I think that you can see that it's somehow even similar to today's types of reconstructions, and moreover something quite postmodernist. And very fresh for the 20s. Then in 1932-1934, representatives of Central Committee of Communist Party, they said, and it was even an article in a newspaper, that it was some very strange idea, and it was like bad taste idea, and all the buildings should be in one style. That it's bad when such a contradictional things is together. So actually, they didn't like that dialectic principle of materialism. And they decided to scratch all the details of historicism from that part of the building and put just columns. And during Second World War, that building was under shelling, actually. And just then, under the reconstruction, just this part preserved. And during Stalinist Reconstruction of Kharkiv, the building appeared like this. So you can see the typical columns, and that is like the essence of socialist realism, because you can see such a heavy order, Corinthus order, and such a big flags. But actually the scale is more or less the same, but the building went a bit in front of the street. And that is a very famous picture from New York Times, Washington Post, and a lot of other very famous media, made by my close friend and as a member of the team of that application that I told you about in the beginning. He was actually an architectural photographer and even wedding photographer, but during the new war, he decided to stay in Kharkiv and document all the destructions of the buildings. And first it was his, decision to document everything connected to exactly with architecture, if he stayed. But then I think that he switched his profession now, and maybe we will never return just to architectural photography, because he actually lost a fear, and that's why I think his future is future of photography reporter of some hot spots and some war zones. So In first days, in first week of the war, exactly that building of regional administration that I deeply criticized for many years during all my guiding tours in Kharkiv, because I really, actually, maybe you understood that already, that I really hate socialist realism, and I think they are actually guilt in demolition of modernist past. But in first days, that building was under the heat. Unfortunately, as I remember, 6 people died there, including very young mathematics there, who decided to stay in that building during that first day as a part of volunteers. And now it looks like that. And that dimension of what was actually our past, including Central Committee of Communist Party, the heart of Communist Party actually, and then the view to another quite beautiful monuments of constructivism and modernism have a bit different frame, I think. And I think that picture can represent exactly that situation, even historical situations that appeared. You can see Держпром building that still alive, still okay, but you can see that from the former windows of Communist Party committee. And I will end maybe my lecture exactly on this picture. And from other side, I think that Freedom Square actually can be not just Freedom Square. All the reconstructions of Ukrainian cities in futures can be new cases of how we will deal with destructed objects, with the demolished historical cities. Because as I showed you in the beginning, demolished cities like Rotterdam, Warsaw, and Dresden, that is the cases actually in our heritage protectionist work. And that is like a historical cases, that is like borderline between different stages of development of our understanding, what we should preserve and how we should actually preserve, and what we should do with our memory and trauma about the Second World War. And according to Rotterdam case, actually modernist architects decided nearly demolished all their ruins and to build a new modernist city. And Rotterdam even now is the capital of the most modern architecture, even now contemporary architecture. From other side, we have the example of Dresden that were rebuilt, but usually people said it's not like, it's a bit false, yeah, and maybe they shouldn't rebuild everything like it was. But it's something about type of thinking, how we think what we should do with something that we actually lost. And from other side, we have Warsaw example. Unfortunately, even in understanding of, even in personal perception of what happened right now in our country, we usually use that narrations and we usually use that examples exactly of the 20th century, exactly of the Second World War. Maybe we have no other tools and we have no other answers, and the one experience to which we can address is just the Second World War. But I'm really hope that we will not go through the example of Stalinist reconstruction of the cities, when actually was no discussion, where the opinion of experts, locals, and historians was never a point for architects, and not just architects, first of all, authorities. And when a lot of cities, they were under so-called sanation or sanatia, and a lot of very interesting objects, very interesting structural urban complexes, they were demolished and didn't reconstruct it at all, or they were under that cover, Stalinist cover of socialist realism. That's why cities actually changed the appearance, they changed the story. And even now, even today, a lot of people think that Zaporizhia looked like it is actually from beginning, and it was like the city of empty space. But actually all the cities, including Kharkiv, they are historical cities. And I think, first of all, we should not to go to the direction of Stalinist reconstructions, And in last days, I think a lot of very active architects, even with some goodwill, they started to imagine and to design some new ideas how they will reconstruct the demolished cities and the demolished objects. I think we should somehow make a pause in that. First, of course, we should win. That is the first aim. Second, we should make like breathing a bit and then start discussion, because in that discussion we should be all together. I'm definitely sure we should be very accurate, because that is something about memory, that is something about history, that is something that was exactly under the target of Russian missiles and the even Russian culture. That's why I'm definitely sure that we should start bigger discussions through which we all grow, not just healing but growing. And I'm definitely sure that today lecture, and I hope for your discussion then and your questions will be one of the starting points for such a bigger discussion about heritage protection and heritage protection during the war in the world, like a common heritage, because I'm definitely sure that that is not just Ukrainian heritage, that is our heritage, that is your heritage, that is common heritage, that is actually the idealistic basement of what we gained after the Second World War when we said never again. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Zhenya. And I would like to ask the audience if they have any questions, or just maybe I will ask you, because when you stopped, when you ended the lecture with saying that it's also our heritage and our architecture, the story of the architecture, I have to ask about. I have to ask you to add one name which is strongly connected with Brno and also with Kharkiv, and I would like to ask you for just a brief story of Lotte Stambeze, the architect who was connected also with Brno, if you could.
The turn. Yes, actually, Lotte Stambeze is such an interesting person. So she graduated, not graduated, she was a student of Bauhaus, and she was one of representative of such a phenomena of women's of Bauhaus. She was the first student of architectural faculty, female student of architectural faculty at Bauhaus at all. And she was very talented, neo-Marxist, I think. She was a member of Comintern, exactly that organization that hotel was built of. But actually, her biography had such a strange dimension, quite gender. That's why she's like one of the most famous architects, because a lot of gender studies specialists and scholars, they studied her biography as an example of what is actually female architects, and like a symbol, I think. So she was in a relationship with Hannes Meyer, the director of Bauhaus, third director of Bauhaus, and because of that relationship, actually, she was quitted from Bauhaus, but not he actually. Then she started working in the bureau where exactly Hannes Meyer worked, and then she got pregnant, and they had a child, a boy. But then, as I remember, she moved to Brno and worked in the bureau. You said me today
Bohuslav Fuchs.
Oh, yeah. And but I know that story really much more about Kharkiv perspective, because I worked together with the historian and biographer of Lotte Stambeze, Hanneke Osterhoff. And Hanneke Osterhoff appeared in Kharkiv and asked me to show the places of the life of Lotte Stambeze. I already knew about Lotte Stambeze in Kharkiv, and that's why we worked together somehow. And what was interesting that Lotta worked in that building actually. She worked as an urban planner here. First she moved here without son, but then she took her son and she lived in an apartment of one of secretaries of Communist Party, Lyubchenko. So she was quite near with political leaders of Soviet Ukraine. She lived there from 1932 till 1933, and she was a person who actually saw Golodomor on the streets of our city. She was very disappointed, and first she was such a believer in ideas of communism, and she was even a member of some protests here in Brno. I remember that she was even imprisoned for a few days after some strike of proletariat or worker class strikes and so on, and she came in Kharkiv. And actually, she saw an absolutely different situation, that not the things that she believed in. First, she even wanted to suggest her it was like talon. It's some paper where it's written how many bread and potato you can take actually, and she had such papers. But workers actually didn't have that, and she was so surprised in such injustice situation that she even gave her papers for that food to workers. Then actually when she was already quite frustrated and depressed of everything that she saw, because she saw some corpse on the streets in Kharkiv, and she understood that people are dying and starving exactly without food, and not everything is ideal in that society. She met in tram on Sumskaya Street that I shown you, her husband Mart Stam, actually the chief architect of Rotterdam, quite famous modernist. And then they decided somehow to escape from Soviet Union. As I remember, they worked some small period in Moscow, but then they escaped. And actually, that thing really saved her life, because a lot of people who from Bauhaus who moved to Soviet Union after Nazi regime came to the power, they were executed, and their lives were never happy actually. So Lotta moved to Rotterdam, and she was one of that architects who actually rebuilt Rotterdam after bombing. Actually, her modernist will, her modernist ideas appeared in Rotterdam, and she is like a mother of Rotterdam modernism. Moreover, what is interesting is that she worked in the team of young architects. I'm sorry if it's too long story, but it's something very important for me. So she worked with other younger architects, Ukrainian young architects, on the project of Kharkiv Tractor Factory Settlement, Socialist City New Kharkiv. And what my surprise was when I appeared in Rotterdam, went to the districts that were designed by Lotta Stambezi in 1953, as I remember, 1956. And it was a part of exhibition of Siam. Maybe you know that was an organization established by Le Corbusier. And I went out from metro or underground, and I saw exactly my Kharkiv Tractor Factory settlement. So even in the middle of her life, on the top of her career, that Kharkiv Tractor Factory still was in her head, and she still produced architecture in the same way as she worked in Kharkiv when she was very young and worked with other Ukrainian architects. It's, I think, very interesting.
And she cooperated on, for example, on Vesna School here in Brno. So you can imagine that the connection is quite nice. And I would recommend you Genia's team web, Ukrainian Constructivism, where you can find the performance, very nice, very impressive performance that is based on the short story of Lotte Stambezi. So you can have a look at it. And so, any questions?
I can understand that architects and art historians definitely prefer modern architecture to that decorative Stalinist architecture. But what about laymen and general public? Do the people see the difference, or they just like this decorative architecture because it looks like historical architecture and they think it's, after all, it's our history?
Yeah, it's very interesting question, and I was very interested in that too. And I remember that maybe in 2015, 2016, I made a few very public lectures with just everybody. Just I made everything to involve in that public discussion as much people as I can, and I described that I shown that pictures, very simple pictures, how it was before and how it is now, and that ideological logic of these things. And after that lectures, like all auditorium of people, they start screaming, let's go there to that object, exactly to this object, and let's take some arms in our hands and just demolish that Stalinist layer. Some people screamed, we need de-Stalinization. Initially, we need to open that initial structure of the city. But the most surprising was, you know, now Putin said that we had a lot of Nazi and nationalists, but at that meeting, it was really two guys who I think they were somehow like skinheads or something like that, and I was very scared all my lecture what they will said, because national communism is quite radical leftist idea. But then they stood up and said, yeah, guys, let's go there. We will gather all other guys and we will just open that 20th to the people. So, and it was even my joke that we will gain some leftist aims by the hands of rights wing guys. So I think that that is much more about discussion, and that it should be based, such decisions should be based on the discussion, because we can imagine different types how we should deal with that. Of course, we can think that it's like layers of Rembrandt, you know, that each layer is quite important. So we need discussion. I remember some postmodernist critics who came in Kharkiv and from Austria, and they stood near that object and they said, it would be very funny if the half of the building we will open up and the half of the building we will preserve in that Stalinist appearance. It will be very funny. But I answered, but our history actually is not funny. That's why I'm not sure that your jokes is okay about that. So I think that is really very important why I used exactly that example, because that example can open up all the situation, how we should deal with such a difficult past and such a difficult objects. And, you know, I think that objects can give us something more like transitional objects in psychotherapy. Through that, we can gain something more. And I have no ideas what to do with that object. It should be definitely based on public discussion with a lot of experts. But I know that Jean-Louis Cohen said about objects that we should demolish and take off all that decorative layer, especially columns. And he said that it will be called like decolonization, because decolonization without columns. That's why I think we can use that example as a type how we behave actually with Stalinist past.
Okay, so.
Do you hear me? Yeah. I have maybe not really a question, but one idea I would like to add to this discussion so far, because now we are struggling almost only with the past, with the history, with all the historical layers. But do you think, what is maybe just your personal opinion on adding some really contemporary layers? Do you think, is there some chance to this, to really rebuild or renew this monumental, this extremely huge space into something much more contemporary? I mean, it is okay for you to not only protect the history, the heritage, which is there already, but also to add something new with all respect, after some discussion again, stuff like that? Thank you.
Maybe you are an architect here?
No.
I'm
very also a historian of architecture like you. But nevertheless, I sometimes like new things.
I think that is the situation when we should make quite difficult decisions, and that is the same like in hospital when you have some contradictional situation and your patient actually you can choose. You should bring your decisions and put your decisions exactly on protocols. So that's why actually for many years a lot of protocols and laws were developed. That's why I think that the one thing that somehow save us in quite civilized discourse is to base our decision exactly on legislation base. So even according to not ideal Ukrainian legislation base that actually allowed a lot of very shitty projects. But at the same time, actually, that heritage objects that were listed, somehow even declaratively, they are protected by law, should be protected. And when we have such a situation of some damaged or some demolitions, actually, according to our law, on heritage protection and preservation, we should rebuild that as they were, because they are historical objects and they are listed in the list of monuments and architectural heritage. Moreover, if we talk about Держпром now is in temporary list of UNESCO, and I'm really hope and I do everything I can to put and to bring that object in actually World Heritage List, actual World Heritage List. That's why I think that it means a lot of procedures, a lot of protocols, how you should deal with such type of heritage that has actually status. So that's why I think that historical areas of the cities, they are actually not the place for some new experiments and some contemporary things. Of course, we could add something nearby. It depends. It depends on the status of territory, because that is areas. And for example, if that square is an ensemble, it means that each part of that ensemble should be preserved exactly in the same way, and to preserve the urban structure of the object, as we think that is actually heritage. But I can say that architects can find a lot of place for their imagination, for their experiments now in such a phenomena, quite beautiful, and it's quite interesting that it appeared in our discourse again as mass housing. So because people all over Ukraine, they lost a lot of apartments, they lost their dwelling. That really is a first need. Because if we talk about some interpretation of spaces, some adding something and to make some postmodernist joke, it's not first need. It's actually some intellectual abstract games. But actually people on that dwelling residential area of Saltovka, they just need to return in some homes. They need new homes. And what is the answer even of some very famous architectural schools of the world? Just build refugee camps. So, guys, architects, please start thinking about not through camps. That is not the 20th century when camps are the answer to any problem. So I think we should somehow start thinking about mass housing. And such a district as Saltovka is a beautiful, huge territory for any experiment, for any contemporary architecture. Please do that.
Thank you.
Okay, so anybody else? Okay, so Zhenya, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. And if there is still wine, please take some, and maybe there will be enough time for more questions or more discussion. Thank you very much, Zhenya.
Thank you.